And I'll start the webinar.
All right, we're back.
Hello, and I think we have our first attendees coming in.
Smashing. Okay, great.
So, hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. Unfortunately, our original speaker couldn't make it, but luckily we have Jake, who stepped in at the last minute, and I'm sure he's going to do a fantastic job replacing Michael.
Let's hope so. So you set me up anyway, so I don't really have any other choice. I only have good. We can't let Michael down. So just for everybody else's sake, Michael's having his first grandchild. Well, he's not having it. His daughter-in-law is, and so he is with the family attending the birth, I suppose. So a very good rite of passage for somebody becoming a grandfather for the first time. I have a 7-year-old. Luckily, that won't be happening anytime fast for me.
Very good. So welcome everyone who's joining now. Just make yourself familiar with the controls of this webinar. There's a chat. If you are sending messages in the chat, do say hello, introduce yourself, maybe where you're from. That would be great. So nice to know where everyone is joining from. And if you do that, make sure that you are sending the message to everyone, not just the panelists, because otherwise everyone will join. We also have a Q&A feature. So if you have any questions that come up during the webinar, please feel free to use the Q&A feature. Both Jake and I will be keeping an eye on that to see if there's any questions that come up and try and answer your questions. That's great. We have people from all over the place: Spain, Berlin, Cambridge, California. Nice.
Colombia. Look at that. We have a Californian? Who's in here? Oh, Martinez. I don't even know where that is. I lived in Redondo Beach for about 20 years or so. I'm just a new transplant from to Oklahoma. My wife is from here, so we're here to spend time with her family. All right. Nice. Hi, everybody.
So just to keep you all interested while we wait for everyone to join, we've created a quick poll. Feel free to answer it. Just give a bit of an impression about where your engineering organization is, and also a bit of maybe a bit of fun in the questions as well. So you'll find that in the poll section on the interface.
Oh, I can't vote. Oh no.
No, you can't skew the results.
Yeah, that's true. I can't do that. I think, well, it's sort of fascinating, and I don't know if we'll talk about this. We might talk about it at the end of it. I work for an automation company, and it's very fascinating to see how that automation sort of goes throughout the company. And I came up as a sales engineer, and we did a lot of our own automation and whatnot, for better or for worse. So I don't know, we may address some of that towards the end here, but there's challenges both ways. I feel like either shifting left or shifting right.
That's very true. Wow, I got a good number of answers already. So if you haven't voted, do jump in. About 2/3 of you've answered so far. Just also for everyone's information, this webinar is being recorded. We will send a link to the recording after the webinar to the email that you registered with. So don't worry about taking notes. You'll get a recording of the webinar straight in your inbox tomorrow morning.
Yeah, fantastic. All right, well, we're getting everybody ready for their survey. I'll just go ahead and share this out, but we can finish up the survey results in the meantime.
Yeah, so survey results are looking good. So I guess we can probably give at least an initial view of the survey results. So by the looks of it, we have a small number of teams or people who have shifted all the way to the left. Some people have shifted to the right. About 1/3 of you have silos for everything, and a good 40+% of you are still wondering why everyone's going in various directions. So That's pretty great. So yeah, with the polling done, it's my great pleasure to introduce Jake Lundberg from Hashicorp, who will be joining us today. He's going to start off with a quick talk about fast, compliant, and adaptiveness when dealing with, I guess, infrastructure and large enterprise setups. So, Jake, I guess over to you.
All right. Thanks, Chris, and welcome everybody. Thanks for attending. Like I said, sorry you didn't get Michael Wood. He certainly has a much different way of presenting this type of material, but pretty good as well. So again, my name is Jake Lundberg, Field CTO here at HashiCorp. I've been here for about 4 years or so. My background is actually in systems administration, network engineering, and DevOps engineering. So I actually came to HashiCorp as a user of our software. So for those of you doing operations and automation, I've lived that life, and a lot of my opinions on that are gonna come from that particular arena. And actually, let me bring this down here to be a little easier to see it down here. Okay, great. So like one of for those of you familiar with the UDO Loop, it was really designed as a way for militaries to be able to quickly respond to situations that happen inside of their environment. But the concept of being able to observe, orient, decide, and act, and then keep that decision process going is very critical as we start to do sort of iterative processing for anything, be it technology, militaries, industrial processes or whatnot. And one of the quote that's associated with this, that 87% of surveyed executives believe digital technology will disrupt their industries, is really pays testament to a lot of the transformation projects that you see that are going on. The ability to act very, very quickly is a differentiator in many cases with any industry. And now the IT processes that we have are being are very core. Almost everybody is considered themselves a technology company these days. You even see the likes of like Cisco, which is traditionally a hardware vendor, even claiming that they are a software company, and rightfully so, because they've started to align behind that rapid iteration of being able to use software to differentiate themselves in the business. So some stats on what the high performing organizations look like. And these aren't just coming from our customers; they're coming from a lot of folks within the field. But the idea is that as you begin to automate more of your infrastructure and more of your application release processes, you become a lot more competitive. You're able to iterate within your application release processes, and those systems of engagement that you have with your customers are able to adapt to the needs of the customers and to the needs of the business very, very quickly. But that comes at something of a cost, though, right? So as we begin to iterate much faster, there is the potential that those fast iterations may not be fully optimized for some other dimensions like security. And then one of the major things that we see a lot of breaches that come in and data loss that happens from these things. So it's if you look at the top breaches, it's sort of amazing. Some of the top technology companies that are out there have had some kind of a data breach. Capital One, actually, very, very interesting, is the fact that they are probably what I would consider to be more with the more advanced sort of cloud and automation users. And even with that extra set of discipline within that ecosphere, they had a problem. Target obviously had that shifting breach through their air conditioning system of all areas. And again, not only do we have this concept of rapid iteration, but we also have very, very complex environments in which we have to think about when we're deploying these things, and lots of dependencies between them as well. SolarWinds probably one of the worst in supply chain attacks. They thinking that these are nation state actors that are attacking the system, but it sort of doesn't matter. It's really that discipline of how you protect those IT supply chains and how the process of making sure that these things are professional. And of course, Morgan Stanley is out there as well. And so The we think about these release metrics in terms of like the speed and the cost of moving our IT processes along. And so, if somebody says, what's the release time for this particular window? But I think there's something else that is also sort of key to understand here is really that the cost of change. Like, what does it cost for your developers to be able to go from one ideation all the way to the end of that thing? But there's also another piece of this as well, is that change can actually introduce risk inside of the environment. And so not only are we looking for speed, but we're sort of understanding what is the cost of that change. Does it increase a risk for things? Does it help the workflow that we have that's there? Does it allow for larger scalability, or does it present any kind of extra risks inside of the system? So things to think about as you're starting to speed up your processes is that not only should you speed up the processes, but you should really reduce any kind of cost of like what the change inside that environment does. Now, one thing I definitely highly encourage folks to realize is that sometimes change in the short term could be more costly because they're new processes, and adopting those new processes can be difficult for humans to actually accept in some cases, and especially if you work in industries that are somewhat averse to change in the first place. Okay, so what is it? These environments are so easy to sort of define, and this becomes sort of the ecosphere of what it is that we're dealing with, right? So in order for me to release something inside the cloud, I'm probably defining some kind of an organization within there. I define the accounts. I define a bunch of VPCs. Define security groups that allow connectivity between these things. Now I've got I have some kind of subnetworking that I have to negotiate within that environment, and then of course any of the rules and networking constructs that actually connect these applications together. And then lastly, how do I actually ingress that data and make sure that I monitor and manage all the connections that are happening within that environment? And whoops, does that fall off the edge over there? Oh, that's kind of weird. Okay. So anyway, sorry about that. But then, again, now we've sort of replicated that. So we've done this inside of one cloud, and now we may potentially have to do this inside of another cloud because, inevitably you've got Linux engineers that probably prefer like GCP or AWS, and you've got Windows engineers that may, prefer to use a cloud like Azure. And then you add in any of the rest of the cloud vendors that are out there and the SaaS vendors and so on and so forth. The complexity of managing these environments can be quite overwhelming for everybody who's consuming these. Oops, what just happened? Okay, cool. And so, so the bigger question is like, are we actually making this easier on people? And I think this is actually from one of our customers. I'm not going to name who they are, but this is just a quick back of the napkin sketch of what their application environment actually looks like today. And you notice there's lots of different technologies, there's lots of different clouds, there's a bunch of different components as well inside of there. And so really, that idea of being able to move very, very quickly and introduce ourselves to these API-driven environments has also created this kind of exploding ecosphere of things that we have to manage and sort of monitor across our entire environments. And so one of the things that we like to highlight is this is a picture of Willow Run, which was a manufacturing factory for the B-24s during World War II. And the other quote isn't in here. Hap Arnold, and I'll paraphrase the quote. He basically said that everybody wanted to fly the B-17 because when the B-17 took off, they came home, and the B-24s did not. And the reason for that is that the B-24s were sort of like a Savile Row suit. They were very bespoke. They were very expensive, but not one of those things was alike. And bespoke is great for suits and things of that nature, but it's terrible for war machines. And so what the folks at Willow Run did is that they enlisted the help of the Ford Motor Company to come in and help them industrialize their processes. Well, sort of interestingly enough, that you would think that industrial process would be the right thing, but what Ford did is that they actually brought in automative technologies or the automated processes to these, and they actually had to do another round of adaptability to actually get to the point where they were professionally making these B-24s. And so they went from about I think it was like 1 a day to like almost close to about 1 an hour. So, an increase in about 24 to 1 sort of increase in productivity. But the reason that they were so successful in doing that is because they were able to break down the processes into very specific components that were reusable across the entire environment. And so what does that sound like? If we relate this into the IT process, well, machine parts are industrialized infrastructure, the wheeling assembly for these things, the actual, sort of micro components that we have could be, analogous to maybe a microservice. And these standardized pipes come to standardized services. So these sort of off-the-shelf services that you would consume from somebody else, as opposed to rolling these things on your own. And that well-defined and consistent workflow, well, that's hopefully is a well-defined and consistent workflow that we see within our tooling. And we'll kind of address that minorly here. So the other thing is this concept of kind of like ad hoc versus intent-driven. And again, this takes on some of the look and feel of these industrialized processes. But if we think about how we used to manage infrastructure and how we manage the applications that we had, a lot of this was very, sort of hands-on, ad hoc. I have an emergency, I need to fix these things. I mean, I was a systems administrator for a long time. I wasn't very friendly to automation when I first started my career. I learned that because of what was happening is that it was actually very mistake prone inside of there. So if we are to produce this kind of professional level of applications, when I have to have humans that are interacting with the system, some of the challenges you have is like, well, now I have to grant network connectivity to these end user systems. Plus I have to track the changes that are made, because you remember the cost of change can be quite serious. And so if I want to know how humans are affecting the system, I really have to pay attention to all the changes that they've made within the system. And then probably after the fact, go back and figure out what happened when something actually goes wrong, as opposed to understanding what happens beforehand. So 8 passwords, yeah, maybe it's 8, maybe it's 100. Password tools are helping these days, but the concept is now these humans have to have a much far greater reach into the identity-based systems within these environments. And it's highly, highly likely that those things don't get rotated very often. The larger the password sort of interface is, the less likely it is that you're going to be able to rotate those things. Again, that concept of not being able to manage these things automatically can introduce the risk of having these long sort of passwords that are out there. And so unmanaged changes, obviously, if somebody doesn't write down what they changed inside of an environment, you have no idea what they did unless you go back to like session recording. And then the ITIL-based processing that's mentioned at the bottom is really this sort of human-based gates into the workflows that we have. But if we go to like an intent-driven system, much like you see very popular within like frameworks like Kubernetes, or just like everything is code, like infrastructure is code or policy is code, is that the concept is that I am going to define the intent of what it is that I want to create in some kind of code-based mechanism. And as I write this stuff down, it also has an extra benefit in the fact that I'm actually auditing what it is that I'm trying to create. So if an auditor comes to me from a compliance standpoint and says, what does your infrastructure for this particular application look like? Well, great. I can just hand them the code of what's there, and they can very easily look through it and say, okay, I understand how it is that your infrastructure is composed and sort of what the surface area of of any kind of issues they may have inside of there. So this says no human access, and typically speaking, we try to reduce the amount of human interaction to the end user systems once they've been deployed. Now, there's always that concept that it says almost, and really what I encourage folks to do is to use human-based processes to understand like how to automate things. So for instance, like if it's your first time inside of AWS, you probably don't know the levers and variables and all the rest of the resource definitions of the things that you're trying to consume. And so it's very, very likely that you're going to have to create those things by hand before you can actually get to the point of automating those. So that's, automation is just an automatic algorithm for something that we would do by hand anyways. And so the idea is that, find out the best sort of configuration for the things that you have, build your automation frameworks to replicate those environments, and then you're able to go through and automate the release of those processes over and over again, which looks very much again like the industrial processes that we talked before. And then there's a centralized process again, assuming that you have some VCS system that tracks and monitors those changes over time, and that you have very specific gates as those things move through. So very different than the ticket-driven system where you assign somebody a set of work, they go off and do that in sort of advanced do here. The concept is that the change control, the change board, or however you call it within the ITIL world, is actually the gate between any of your merges inside of your code. So as I start to begin to move my code through these various stages, that approval process becomes the surface area for the changes that you're going to have inside of your system. And of course, on the backside is as you run whatever automation processes that you have, is that information is gathered in some kind of logging SIF stuff, and that's sort of auditing the intent, but also auditing the results of your progress as well. So another kind of term that we hear out here is this concept of shift left. We started off with this, and I think what this sort of does is it burdens your developers to become these sort of dev, sec, fin, net, whatever ops, kind of add in whichever discipline that you have onto the developers. And I think that, that is somewhat of a mistake, right? And I think that the major reason for that is that certain folks are really better suited for specialization, and finding this unicorn who has all these capabilities of being able to do all the roles in the same way that you would do if you had them spread out between the individual people is extremely expensive and also possibly risk prone. And when we think about like cloud efficiencies and like getting to there, we think, well, if we just make the developers do everything because they're developer mindset, that we're going to get greater sets of efficiencies. But we've seen some cases at least where that doesn't actually work for folks. And if we think about the industrialized processes, really developers just want to write and release code. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But when we start assigning the developers with the task of the other roles, we're really sort of overburdening the developers. And we're not saying that's not pejorative in saying that the developers can't learn these skills to efficiently operate in the cloud. But when we think about the industrialized process, is that the specialization of labor, and especially the coordination of that labor, brings a lot larger efficiencies in the long run. So your operations folks are really great at creating and maintaining infrastructure. And so the SRE discipline, the site reliability engineering discipline, has really helped push automation techniques into operations. Again, I come from a systems administration background, and we call it DevOps. It's SRE. I guess it sort of depends on where you got your title, who bestowed your title on you. The networking folks obviously still provide a lot of value in getting that data plumbing and the understanding of network primitives that you have. And of course, your security folks are there to help, sort of guide you on the policies and sort of the frameworks of how to protect your networks and your applications and things. And so that concept of shift left, can also, go right. So that was part of the query that was here, is like, how many of you are shifting left and shifting right? And really the concept is, instead of taking all of these duties and giving them to the developers, you really take the concept of the developer discipline and move it to the rest of these duties. And again, not that I have the poster child for this, but I had to learn automation primitives as a systems administrator in order to really think about how to industrialize the processes. And I worked for an ad tech company, and it's a very fast moving, high data driven environment. And there's no way we could do these things by hand. And so really it was the adaptability of the folks who have specialized skills of learning this skill set that's really important. And this goes into like lots of other areas as well. And you may have folks who are doing, music or art or something like that. They're using programming and automation to help them along in their art. And so, sorry, Chris, I forgot I have kind of a survey inside of here, but you feel free to answer. It's not going to be anonymous, and that's okay. But I'm going to ask you a question, and feel free to answer or not. But should you open an S3 bucket to the world? So if you're AWS users, S3 is the object store out there. But the question is, should you take that S3 bucket and should you open that thing to the world? I'll give you a few seconds to answer in the chat. If you're shy, don't worry about it. But feel free. I'm very, very curious, and don't worry, we're not going to make fun of you whichever way that you go. Okay. It's nice for me to have these breaks because then I can take a drink, right? Okay. All right. We've got a couple different opinions on how that is. We've got it depends, no, kind of an odd thing to do. Yeah, if there's a reason, it'd be fine. Okay, great. Thanks for the interactive part of the survey. But you're absolutely right. And so I think a handful of y'all have touched on it, and it really depends. And the entire point of this talk is that when we as humans, go off and sort of do these things by hand, or even in automated fashion, and we bring with us the sort of policies, intrinsic policies that we have, because we've learned these things over time through experience. That, like, I know a lot of folks, probably by default, the right answer to that answer is no. We really shouldn't open S3 buckets up to the world. But again, there are cases where they have it. I actually run my web page off from S3 because I haven't gotten into the Google GitHub pages type of pattern in there. It'd probably be a lot cheaper. But the concept is like there are particular cases where those things are acceptable. And typically speaking, the folks who are traditionally responsible for doing that kind of deployment of that infrastructure are probably the right people to understand whether that policy should be applied or not. And so really the concept here is that we have these specialization of labor. You've got your developers that are building to a particular standards and understanding what the workloads would look like. The operations folks are making sure that you have a proper scope of resources and that those things are up and running all the time for everybody, and the policies that it takes to get to there. The networking folks, of course, ensuring that you have like capacity and isolation for your applications, and then your security folks really focused on the concepts of least privilege and protecting that data, both your proprietary data as well as the data for your particular customers that are out there. And so again, the concept really being leverage the expertise of the folks that are there and teach them to actually learn how to program. Now that, again, if you want to shift left, that's fine, but I think there's other answers. And really, if we focus in on sort of that industrial concept, it's very rare that you see one robot that builds the entire car. Maybe they'll 3D print them in the future, and I'll be wrong. But as it is right now, we kind of move those things along an assembly line, much like we did with humans who would like, I grew up in Michigan and I was right down the street from Fisher Body. It used to be like one human's task to like, hammer in the trunk or something like that, or put on the door. And maybe it doesn't have to be so boring as that, but the concept is that specialization of duty can actually bring you much larger gains if you teach people that concept of automation, and then we all become programmers or automation friendly in the future, right? Okay, just kind of like wrap it up in how this relates to Hashicorp. Not quite a commercial, but really for those of you who are familiar with Terraform is a tool. It's an infrastructure as code tool that allows you to codify any of your cloud resources, but it has 2,000-ish providers, and the clouds are like 5 of those providers, right? So there's lots of SaaS providers, there's networking technologies. You can order a pizza with a Terraform provider if you really, really want to, if you're in the States and like Domino's, which I don't, but it's fine. Like if you really wanted to, you could Terraform a pizza to your house. So there's a wide ranging ability to affect things that have APIs to them. And so the workflow sort of looks like you have developers who are responsible for the code. They're responsible for managing their applications, but they also get some help from some of the other folks that are out there. Your operations folks, because they're the experts in creating infrastructure, may be the folks who create the baseline modules that are consumed by developers and other folks that are out there. And on the policy side of things, you may have, there's a curate, we're missing a Y inside there, but you may have different functions within your organization that help advise you on the type of policies that your infrastructure should adhere to. And then you can enforce those policies as you begin to walk through the system. So in Terraform Cloud and Terraform Enterprise, there's the plan phase. Well, just a normal Terraform, the plan phase is basically, here's my code and here's what I plan on creating inside of my environment. And there's a state-based system inside of Terraform that tells you what's the difference between your code and the existing set of infrastructure that you have. The state is like, that's the current state of your infrastructure. The code is the desired state of your infrastructure. And whatever the delta is between the desired state and sort of the actual state is what comes out on the apply phase. But in between that plan and apply phase, you can run a set of policies that says things like, our developer instances greater than, like an M class in the AWS world? Or is somebody running GPU instances inside of a development environment? Or all of my resources tagged so that I can associate my workloads for cost and chargeback or whatever inside of those environments, or just understanding where my infrastructure lies inside of there, right? And so again, the concept is collaborative. We have our operations folks, our networks folks, security and compliance. They help to drive some of the codification of those resources, and then those things can be consumed by our developers. Now, that's not to say that developers who are very infrastructure friendly can't write the infrastructure. We know folks that they're very, very good at that. And the overall lesson there, though, is like, find those people who are motivated to do the thing that you're trying to do very, very well, and allow them to do those things. And part of that's a community-driven model. Understand where your strengths are, and if wherever your weaknesses are, leverage some of those other functions within your organization to help drive these things. And so, overall, the concept is, get towards having, more of an industrialized feel of what you have if you want to, really produce this world, sort of first-class architecture as quickly as possible. But just realize that as you introduce, sort of change and the change of processes in your system, you can potentially introduce some risk if you start to apply infrastructure policies that don't quite meet up with what you previously had in terms of your security and sort of professional infrastructure that you might have. So again, not to say that developers can't do everything from tip to tail. I know some developers that are full stack, including infrastructure, but don't expect that everybody necessarily wants to do that. Find the motivations, find the platform, find the tools, and hopefully use some kind of consolidated platform to release your infrastructure, release your applications, and do that sort of thing. So that's really all I had. We've got a question inside of the Q&A. We'll kind of from IAC from the current and proposed new plan. Yeah, so I guess this depends on what you mean by infrastructure diagram. So there is a process inside of Terraform where you can dump out the graph of what is going to be created inside of your system, but it doesn't create like what I would consider to be like a pretty diagram in the case of like an AWS diagram that you can do inside of some of these tools that are here. Now, this is actually something that we get a lot of questions about, and it's something that we're looking for in the future about being able to provide people with a very clear picture of the current state of their infrastructure without having to like dig through state files or look through the graph files that are out there, Keith. So cool. Oh, and then sort of, yeah, so the differences between those, currently we don't have those capabilities, but again, I think, sort of stay tuned. Again, it will be part of the enterprise products more likely that we'll see in the future, but there are some also open source tools that people have. Actually, I think some of our developers here at Hashicorp have some. If I can find them before we get off of the talk, I'll share them with you. If not, I might send them out through Chris through that thing. I know there's a couple of like kind of open source tools that are out there for that kind of thing. Okay. Yeah, cool. Thanks, Keith. All right, cool. We've got Terraform deliveries. All right. I don't see any other questions that are in there. All right, Chris. What do you think?
Yeah, so thanks for that talk. I just wanted to bring in, we were talking a bit earlier before about how we can fit things together kind of from this developer perspective. And you mentioned keeping people specialized in the thing that's looking at them. One of the things that we think about a lot at Humanitec, actually, with kind of internal developer platforms in mind, is making sure there are strong interfaces that people can work against. So if you are not a full stack developer who does everything from writing the code through to provisioning infrastructure, how can you have a clear way of kind of handing things off, or like understanding how much into that infrastructure you kind of went into? And so I was just kind of thinking about, with especially something like Terraform, where actually gaining understanding of Terraform is quite an intense process, especially if you're just coming from, say, an enterprise Java background and you get dropped into Terraform. That's quite a big change. But using something like internal developer platform to, again, as you say, describe intent. So for example, take the S3 bucket example, you might say, hey, I want an S3 bucket for, I know, storing whatever things that people are going to download. And then actually describing that as an intent rather than as a Terraform definition, and then allowing the platform itself to pick that up and then choose the correct Terraform module to use in order to drive that forward. So basically kind of pushing the intent down the line rather than like pushing the code back the other way.
Yeah, so I feel like I spend a tremendous amount of time on this subject, and a lot of it has to do with the way that people structure their organizations, right? So there's a couple of like competing models that I see, and the two ends of it is like something like a cloud center of excellence, where you have a desire for somebody else to give you the infrastructure that you want. And you sort of push that intent, maybe through a ticket system or through some other interface that says, hey, here's what we want to create for a particular application. Here's what the architecture looks like. And somebody over, in this one center of excellence area really allows you to, may create that code for you and then, submit it to a repository. In the case of like open source Terraform, maybe it's just inside of a VCS repo. In the case of like Terraform Enterprise or Terraform Cloud, they may push it up to the private module registry, and then sort of give you the interfaces for how to hook into those things. And at that point, the interface is really just variable driven more than anything else. The other model that I see folks really starting to move to, or is more of like the federated community-based model. And this comes back to what I was talking about before in terms of the motivations that you see people have. There are some folks who are like very, very infrastructure friendly. Maybe they've had some experience doing it in the past. And I've even seen cases where people, say create bounties and they say, hey, I have a need for this, particular style of infrastructure that I have out there. Who can create this thing? And, if they were able to create it within some period of time, they may actually get rewards with it within their organization. And the thing you start to realize is as you have this community-based model is that those folks who are more motivated to do these things will actually stick out quite a bit. And so now you sort of have these, it's not a center of excellence, it's kind of a distributed model of excellence that's out there. And the other piece of that too is like, it's really about what your communication loops look like when you produce these automated bits of infrastructure. And I think one of the sort of failures that I'll see in a lot of customers is like, let's say, for instance, they use the public registry or they use the private module registry, and they know for sure that the VPC module that they've created is like best in class, and they create it and they publish it to the registry, but then they don't tell anybody, right? And so what happens is I'm a different engineer in a different business group, and this happens in large companies all the time, is that I'll actually go out and find the thing in the public registry and I'll hack on it myself. And then I'll do the same thing. I'll publish this thing. And what you notice is there's some variance between there because, one person has a different opinion as to what the VPC should look like. And another one has a different opinion as to what they look like. And so a lot of it, what we suggest people do is to find ways of like publishing and subscribing to the updates that are happening inside of infrastructure if you're going to be one of those people that develops inside of there. And so not only that, but then you can actually throw, like you're saying, your intent of needing something that's out there, again, whether it's a ticketing system or through the community driven system, is that once you've defined what that intent is and define your architecture, you can submit it through the community, and the community hopefully inside of your company will help you get to it. Of course, we know how that goes with the community. Sometimes you throw something into the community and maybe it doesn't come back. But also what we found is that with highly recognized communities, those people who are incentivized to help folks out, it's highly likely that either they're going to steer you in the right direction or they're going to help you develop those things and possibly mentor yourself as well. The other sort of cornerstone of that community driven environment though is really, how do I enable everybody to have a baseline knowledge of how everything works and then how to actually communicate with the community itself? Okay, so like if that's that interface piece of it that you're talking about. So whether it's through a BBS or some kind of forum-based system like a Stack Exchange or something along those lines inside of your company, or maybe it's Slack, which is, please don't do long-term stuff inside of Slack, that'll get lost. But there is that that constant feedback loop and communication within your community, especially within your company or within several companies, for instance, if you have other folks that have that level of expertise. So again, those models are there, like in the concept of a registry. Again, I think the major failure that I find is that there's just so much information that's out there. And as you begin to automate things very specifically within your environment, the best thing that I've seen is that people actually publish their sort of best in class capabilities and then share them with the rest of the community inside of their company as well. So hopefully that answers your question.
Very much so. I think we have another question that's just come in on the Q&A.
Yeah. Is there a way? Yeah. So there are a couple of different testing frameworks that are out there. I know TerraTest is one of them. And then I think like Gruntworks also has some tools that they use for doing testing stuff. Again, this is a heavy want from the community, and it's something that we are absolutely looking at from the Hashicorp side of things. I honestly don't know what the timelines are for that, but I've certainly heard that we're aligning behind the request for us to be a lot more testing friendly on the backside. But as it is right now, there are some open source tools like TerraTest, and again, some of the Gruntworks tools that are out there for doing those testing. And I think there's a test feature inside of the Terraform code itself. I forget what the command is. I think it might actually just be test, but I highly encourage you to look at some of that stuff, see if it fits your needs for the testing side of things. And again, stay tuned. We'll have some updates to Terraform itself to be able to be a little bit more testing friendly. How do you test your CI/CD pipelines from developer from being deployed to the cloud? Keith, I may need some clarification on that. Are you you're saying that you don't want the developer tools being deployed to the cloud? Like where would you expect them to be delivered to? From developer, any tests? Yeah, I guess I maybe need some clarification on what that. So are you saying how do you test the CI/CD pipelines, or are you saying how do you prevent them from being deployed to the cloud? Okay, cool. We'll wait for the for the follow-up answer for that one from Keith. Keep it coming. Okay. Oh, right. How do you monitor CI/CD pipelines for their health status? I think a lot of that's going to depend on the CI/CD pipelines that you're using. In the case of something like Terraform Cloud or Terraform Enterprise, for instance, the status of what's happening inside of there will either be communicated inside of the UI or possibly even given back to the version control system that you have. So, for instance, like we have a capability of being able to do updates inside of like Terraform Cloud, for instance. If you were to update the code repository inside of a GitHub or something, you'll actually have webhooks that'll communicate back to GitHub. And technically speaking, assuming nothing goes wrong, it's highly unlikely that you'll have to actually look inside of the system itself, inside the UI. And Terraform Cloud does have a free version. So if you're sort of interested in what that process looks like, that's there. Now, if it's a Circle CI or it's Jenkins or something along those lines, the way that you monitor those things will probably be very specific to that particular tooling that you have. But one of the things is that you do get return code statuses from Terraform, so you could instrument any of the kind of observability into those pipelines that are there. Again, it's going to really depend on the platform that you have, and I'm not sure if that answered your question or not. But again, I think it's a large. It sort of depends inside the pipeline. All right.
Okay, great. I have one more question coming in. We'll probably take maybe one more off that, and then I think we're done.
Yeah. So what do I think about infrastructure as code versus infrastructure as data? Well, I can't be very well informed because I haven't used any infrastructure as data tool sets, but I've certainly seen the concept of what it is that the infrastructure as data has. And to be honest with you, there is some looping constructs and things like that within the Terraform data set, because there are dependencies between objects that you have. And so you may have like downstream dependencies on things to be able to hook those things together. And the only real way to get through large sets of sort of numerical or enumerated data sets is to have some kind of looping and dependency constructs that are there. Now, that being said, if we can get to the point where you don't have to have those type of dependencies, and where you don't have to have some kind of functional logic inside of the environment, and maybe the functions contained inside of another set of data set or something like that, then I think it's great. I mean, again, if we come back to the concept of intent that we had before, the intent should actually be able to be described very, very easily with just a very easy interface into the system. And I think what we typically find, though, is that from a consumption standpoint, like if you were to develop a set of modules and then publish those to a registry, the best modules that I've seen, typically the only interface that you have into those things is really just a set of variables, right? And so it ends up looking like infrastructure is data to the consumers, but there is that kind of lifting process of being able to do those, harder dependency mappings and looping constructs between trying to create, large numbers of things and whatnot that are out there. So again, I think it's fantastic. But again, what we typically find is that as we get to more self-service infrastructure, the consumers of that are really just supplying data. And we see this in platforms all over the place. You see it in like constructs that you find within like Netflix with like the Wally framework. They're very, very good at hiding the implementation details of the platform from the people that are consuming it. And you see some of this in the Kubernetes world as well, whereas like you're defining the intent for what it is that your objects are supposed to be doing in Kubernetes, and you don't have to worry about crazy looping constructs and whatnot. But then again, if you look at the vast majority of folks that might be using Kubernetes in the long run, it's highly likely they're using a product like Helm, which again is sort of this looping construct of being able to create this thing as data. And so inevitably, when you have these dependencies and the ability to create scalable architectures, it's highly likely that just getting to pure data as a consumption is probably hiding some abstract details or hiding some implementation details in the back. But hey, if we get to that point, that's great. And I'd like to see some more of that as well. Let me see. I'm happy to answer some of these questions. So do you like more all resources in one project? Split IAM for the rest of cloud and Kubernetes, different roles. So Peter, it's an interesting question. I think a lot of coordination of the structure of modules is going to largely depend on how much sharing you're going to have to do between classes and how composable you want those things to be. And so let's just take an instance of like a VPC or something along those lines, right? So if I were to take a VPC definition and I have, 3 different sets of architecture that are consuming a VPC, and they're very different. Like maybe one is RDS driven, maybe one is like a Kubernetes roll your own kind of thing, and maybe one something else, some other set of services completely. Well, if I embed the VPC data in each of those separate sets of modules, highly likely what's going to happen is that there's going to be some kind of drift between the definitions of those VPCs between those various environments. And so if you're into like that concept of don't repeat yourself, and like we hear from the Python world, that concept of dry, the drier you are, the better. Now, there's always some inconsistencies with that, with the way that Terraform works, especially the open source side of things, which is why we've created workspaces the way that we did inside of Terraform Cloud and Terraform Enterprise, was really to allow you to try to use the code reuse without so much of that copy and paste between those particular environments. And so again, I think that's there. And the other part of it too is kind of what you're talking about, is the different roles. You may very well find that a high level module for creating a stack of resources from an application, the sub modules are created by different folks. So maybe your networking folks that are really, really good at understanding networking primitives and how to do particular types of versioning and certificate management and all that kind of stuff. And they may be very good at defining those things. And then you may consume that alongside somebody who's defining Kubernetes stack or their or VMs or something along those lines. And they may be completely different groups of folks that are doing that. That's not to say that's the best model. Again, whatever model works for your organization, I think, is the best. But think about scalability and the ability to allow another team to consume the work that you've done in a way that doesn't have them have to recreate that environment. And also, like, again, like in the case of a singular resource, it's much better to reuse those modules if possible into higher level modules. Now, that does introduce some extra sets of complexity as well. So whether or not you want to deal with like complex nested modules, or if you want something to be completely flat, a lot of that's just going to depend on sort of your philosophy about how you're going to define that infrastructure and who you're sharing it with. We haven't figured out how to pin Terraform to an older version of the module, making tags. Yeah, so actually, that's a great question, and this is where that concept of composability really comes down to, and that's actually a great addendum to the previous question, is that if you have a mono repo that has many different kinds of resources that are defined inside of there, and you make a change to the repo, and it's only affecting one part of the module, your versioning affects the entire module. And that's another really great reason for creating composable pieces within the module set, is because then you have a little bit more fine granularity in terms of how you define the versions that are there. So, so again, back to that concept of a VPC, like if the VPC gets an update and it's embedded inside of lots of other modules, for whatever reason, you added a new resource or you added a new capability within AWS, or sort of pick your cloud. Now you're gonna have to go through all the rest of those sort of large mono repos and update them and update the versions to be able to consume that from a virtual pinning standpoint. And so that is another great reason that you might want to split down into more modular cases for the infrastructure, just because that way you can really do better version pinning, and the changes are very laser-like to the specific function of which you're having out there. Now, the other side of it too is that now you've introduced the fact that now I have to track versions across a large array of different modules, but there's version ranging and things like that can help you out in there to help accelerate that kind of things. Let's see, we started creating common repo, TF modules. It's kind of really, do you have any suggestions on how to share them effectively, or things in network pitfalls? Okay, sorry, I'll read the question. We're starting to create a common repo with TF modules at work. And your comment regarding building the community and subscribing to updates there was really interesting. Do you have any suggestions on how to share them effectively, or things that don't work, pitfalls? Yeah, so I think the cases that I've seen that I think are probably my favorite are much like I was saying, like a Stack Exchange or something along those lines. And internally to companies, a lot of folks have like internal bulletin board services or bulletin board type services like that, and that allow you to basically subscribe and publish information to something that people watch. And so if you think about how you get notifications for, any of your social media platforms, like via Twitter or Pinterest or whatever, really you're subscribing to a set of information that's being published by people who, you're interested in having. And I think that pub sub model is probably what I consider to be most successful that's out there. And we actually have a very similar process inside of Hashicorp. When we do releases of products, when we do updates, if you subscribe to those channels, you can understand what those updates are inside of those environments. And then to some extent, we see those things often getting passed along to folks who aren't watching those areas of the community, because they may, for whatever reason, they may not be interested in getting all that information, but there's always some salient points that happen inside of there. And so from a development standpoint, I'd highly encourage folks to get into that kind of pub sub model with the tooling that you have internally within your environment, or just find some other tooling. It's in there. Like I kind of said, hey, don't use Slack, but to be honest with you, if you're looking for updates, Slack is a great way to do that, or whatever sort of internal chat tool that you might have, because if it has a very specific release form that's tailored to the type of technologies that you're updating, then it's very, very easy to say, okay, a new module has been posted for VPC. And then the other side of that is that the publishers should be very explicit in what it is that they did. Why did they make the change? Why did they add the module? And then are there any sort of interface changes or anything like that you have to be worried about? Obviously, if you have breaking changes inside of your environment, be very vocal about that. And that happens from time to time, right? Because we have, folks put out new providers. I just had one of my customers the other day, come at us and they said, hey, look, we had this new provider that came out last month and we moved all of our stuff onto the new provider and it broke a bunch of stuff. And we're like, well, okay, maybe move something small at the first part of it, see what happens, find out what breaks, and then start migrating the rest of it once you get to that particular endpoint. But then what would happen in that particular case is they've gone through a bunch of struggles. And I think it's actually very good to document and share the struggles that you've had, the things that have broken, if you update those things, because the downside is probably going to be far more interesting to folks than the upside in a lot of cases. Because if you make a change to a new version and it breaks something, well, everybody's going to be mad if they roll that thing out and it breaks their current infrastructure. So again, look for any kind of pub sub tools that you have inside of your environment. It sort of doesn't matter what they are, but again, if you have those kind of tooling inside of your environment, those work really well. It may just be email, right? It could just be an email list that you have, all the way to kind of a bulletin board type service, or even Slack for that matter. All right,
great. Thank you very much, Jake. That was some great questions for everyone, and thanks for taking the time to answer them. So yeah, I think we should probably wrap up there, because we've overrun our slot a little bit, but thank you everyone for sticking around. So just to remind you all, the webinar has been recorded. We will be sending a link to the recording and an email. And Jake, if you want to add anything, I'm happy to add that to the email before we send it out.
Okay.
I think you mentioned that you had a few resources.
I think, for the testing type stuff. Yeah, sure. Yep. I can email that to you. I think let me look. I'm sure we probably was like awesome list somewhere that has all that stuff in there. So I'll hunt that down and share it with you.
Great. Yeah. So we'll make sure that's in. And so in that case, thank you very much, Jake, once again for coming and also stepping in at the last minute for Michael. I think you did a great job.
Happy to be here, and thanks for the invite, Chris. I appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.
Great. And thank you very much, everyone else.